anger does not evaporate. It festers, grows stronger, finds itself with no realistic alternative to which it can turn. Many people in this world are angry. They need to feel that people are speaking to their desires and seek to represent them. That is why we support the norm of anger. What do we mean in this debate? First, anger is one element of the popular discourse, obviously not the only element of the popular discourse, and in particular, we think there's a natural political incentive not merely to be angry, but also to propose constructive solutions that you believe might work on the basis of that anger, because you need to make a corresponding promise to voters. Secondly, we need to be realistic about the manner in which these norms are imposed. So obviously the opposition teams can say they want a norm in which we aspire to objectivity, but they can't control the way in which that norm takes place, and in particular, a crucial tenet of our case is that any norm against anger will inevitably be selectively imposed against particular minority groups who are most likely to need political representation. If any of that's unclear, I'm happy to take a point. Otherwise, I'm going to make three arguments. The first one is that embracing anger is necessary to allowing the oppressed to have their say. The starting point for this argument should be, clarification? Nope. Should be that there is very good reason for many people to be angry. When we consider the history of disenfranchisement faced by African American people who have been dealt out of voting by gerrymandering, when we consider people being denied clean water in Flint while that's treated as a baseline for human rights and human dignity elsewhere. The opposition teams are asking those people to do the impossible by crystallising that anger down into something that's consumable for the public. Why do we believe that that's very hard? Firstly, that structurally, minority groups are often locked out of other ways to explain their political situation. For one thing, because the innate features of those situations is that they should aspire and arouse anger. But for another thing, they're often denied the education required to talk about these issues, especially in the context that our language is constructed to conceal the cruelty around them. It's very difficult for uneducated people to explain in a dispassionate way why the words enterprise bargaining agreement are a synonym for workers being exploited out of their labour and screwed over by bosses who don't give a shit out of them. Even if you think it's possible for you to explain that to people, many workers do not feel capable of doing so. Secondly, even if the leaders of that movement can speak that way, it often does not resonate with other people in that movement. Your base sees it as unrealistic. That's why anger is important. It's the best way to get people to listen because it speaks to the desires that they really feel. Obviously, the opposition bench might say, well, what about an alternative like Obama's successful use of the politics of hope? Isn't that an example of people being able to speak to oppressed groups without reliance on anger? We think to say that would rely on the incredible success of the African American community in harnessing black people's anger as the conversation starter on which the civil rights movement was then capable of building. But it was needed to draw attention to these issues, to make it an issue in political discourse so that people then had access to the language and the media attention required to speak about these issues in the calmer way that the opposition teams might support. Lastly though, even if this norm is in principle acceptable, in practice it is selectively applied. And in particular, it is selectively applied against minority groups who are more likely to, due to stereotypes, be seen as violent or intimidating when they are speaking in a way that would be acceptable if it came from white individuals. And that is certainly the status quo in the United States, for example, when Donald Trump, the angriest, most unacceptable president literally ever, gets what is not a free pass, but is clearly way closer to a free pass than any candidate from a minority grouping would. It is important that people from minority groups have the capacity to compete with that rhetoric. Embracing the norm of anger is essential to doing that. This point is essential because it speaks to the capacity of people to be represented in public life and to have their full democratic rights enfranchised. Only we're capable of getting that. My second argument is that embracing the politics of anger is a necessary step in order for us to respond to extremism.
Unless you want your norm to not say that there is levels of anger which are too great, stereotypes will still mean that certain groups are perceived as too angry.
Yes, that is obviously correct. However, it is also obviously incredibly uncomparative. Because, for example, if you are capable of saying, we've been screwed over by the capitalist machine, just so long as you don't ramble on about it for half an hour, that would make it much easier for minority groups to access political discourse. Let's talk about extremism. The sources of anger are not in essence political. People feel it when globalization rips their jobs out from under their feet and makes it way harder for them to feed their family. That's why even when politicians don't speak in angry ways, that feeling of anger remains within them. We think that the norm of anger is required for those people to feel like they can stay in the mainstream political discourse rather than turning to extremism. Firstly, because the status quo is that people feel that no one speaks for them. That means that they turn to extremists outside of the political system because they don't believe that there's any other way in which they can be successful. Secondly, the status quo is that because all anger is seen to be unacceptable, people cannot differentiate between productive anger and unproductive anger. So for example, people see the anger of Orban as the only alternative to which they can turn because he is the only person they see as speaking to them, but they do not see other political alternatives talking about the fact that it's not immigration, but for instance policies of austerity in Europe, which have caused their suffering. It is vitally important that given that the status quo is that there is some level of anger, we allow everyone to have the capacity to access that anger, rather than encouraging people who feel it to turn to alternatives outside of the mainstream political system. The last point I'm going to make in this speech is that embracing anger as a norm is necessary to challenge stereotypes about who can and who can't be successful in political discourse. Women in particular under the status quo are caught in a double bind. Either they are dismissed as angry and nasty women, or they speak in a calm and dispassionate way and are then seen as submissive, weak individuals who are not capable of inspiring passion. And nowhere do we see that more true than in the case of Hillary Clinton, for instance, who was heavily criticised as not showing any love for the people of America, but as soon as she started to show any passion, was seen as an angry woman who wasn't holding her place and was being too emotional for life in the public discourse. The reason why anger is necessary to challenge those stereotypes is that being angry is the very thing which allows people to prove that they are not submissive, to prove that they are capable of speaking directly to other people. Obviously, to some extent, our norm would still be selectively applied, but it would be way easier to call out that selective application if you could say, for example, well, we accept the anger of all of these candidates, so we should also accept Hillary Clinton's anger, for example, rather than the status quo, which is we say no anger is acceptable, which means that people who speak in dispassionate tones about enterprise bargaining are seen as legitimate politicians, whereas the people who speak to minority groups are far too often dismissed. Anger is essential to our political discourse for the people who need it most. We propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his remarks and invite the Leader of Opposition.
First question I'm going to address is why a norm of anger in public debate would lead to greater discrimination against those who are currently oppressed. The construction of social norms by privileged groups has always meant that some people are locked out of anger, regardless of whether or not that anger is seen as a legitimate part of public policy or not. Black anger will always be seen as threatening, where white anger is seen as righteous and justified. The anger of a woman will always be seen as hysterical. And opening government's analysis on this issue really relies upon the assertion that the existence of a norm of anger would make the anger of some individuals more accepted because it would be seen as the norm. There are a number of reasons that this is not true. Firstly, the power structures that dictate who and who should not be able to participate in public policy debate is not about whether or not the anger of a certain individual. It's not about anger in general. It's about whether or not women and black people, for instance, should have space in public policy debate at all, and that is far less likely to be afforded to those individuals when they are seen as launching personal attacks against other individuals or speaking out angrily and taking up more space in that discourse. Secondly, the reason that public power structures are constructed in a way that makes people's emotions seem unimportant, yeah? The rhetoric that's used to disempower black people is to say that the anger that they feel is not legitimate, something that is not the case when people speak dispassionately about being arrested on the street or dispassionately about the discrimination that they face. Thirdly, then the reason that anger is a value judgment, which means that the question of whether or not anger is legitimate is a question of whether or not the society in which that anger takes place sees the feelings that back that anger as legitimate or not. The problem with that is that in a racist society or in a patriarchal society, those value judgments are far more likely to be made in favour of the privileged and the dominant groups in society. Finally, for the reason that individuals who belong to privileged groups are better at engaging in angry politics, because the individuals that are disempowered are more vulnerable, are more subject to attacks. the individuals who are in power have the confidence of being in the majority and have been told since they were born that they have a claim to privilege in that society, which means that they're far more likely to be adept at engaging in the sorts of insults that make individuals from marginalised backgrounds feel disempowered. Now, obviously, as opening government claims, there are some instances where individuals do feel like they cannot participate in public discourse as a result of having to mediate their anger. But we would suggest, firstly, with respect to their argument that women will be seen as submissive if they engage dispassionately, that is entirely false. Hillary Clinton, for instance, engaged in an assertive, but not angry, assertion of the fundamental position of diminution that women enjoyed in society, and we would suggest that people ought to continue speaking out in that way. And the other claim is like, well, white people currently do not get punished under the status quo. Well, the first thing to say about that is, yes, they do. Overwhelmingly, even the Republican Party in the United States still defaults to the politics of respectability and continues to call out other members of the Senate and House of Representatives when they are out of line. And we would suggest that the example of Donald Trump is just an example of anger that has been successfully mediated to some extent. Now, obviously, he's still an incredibly angry man, but it would be far worse had this norm, had the norm of anger in public policy existed. Their final claim is, well, people cannot, like some people cannot speak. Firstly, many of these groups default to allowing certain individuals to speak on their behalf, which is something that would be very effective. But the second thing to say is, well, people can experience the day-to-day suffering that they endure, or the day-to-day, exploitation that they experience at the hands of their bosses in a way that is measured. And opening government significantly underestimates the capacity of the ordinary working class person to do so, because that is something that they do experience from day to day. They are able to distill it into a set of experiences that are likely to be found persuasive by other individuals in the sphere of public policy debate, which is precisely why a norm of dispassion would be preferable to a norm of anger. Secondly, on public policy, this makes decisions that are made about public policy far worse. Firstly, for the reason that it makes it far easier for those discussions to descend into personal attacks, and individuals are incentivized to make discussions descend into those personal attacks, both because privileged groups in society are more likely to have greater power when they're about personal elements, which is something that I've already proven, but also because a politics of anger makes it more likely that the person who is seen as winning a debate is just the one who is seen as more dominant over the other people in the room, which is precisely why personal attacks are likely to be the nexus of public policy debate. Secondly, because there are some legitimate trade-offs in a policy setting that would be very difficult to discuss were the default in politics to be angry about everything. For instance, you might say an environmental policy has a detrimental effect on workers, but those workers would feel aggrieved, and if the norm went to anger, would kind of be angry about that policy, and the debate would stop there. The problem is there are compromises in policy debates that necessitate a degree of calm and dispassion in order to work out the precise metric by which we should make trade-offs. Thirdly, the reason that it makes policy debate more polarizing because it's about saying certain policies are abhorrent. And finally, for the reason that particularly in vulnerable states or in vulnerable democracies, this not only creates a risk of violence when the respectability that currently exists in developed countries, for instance, is less tangible in fledgling democracies, but also undermines faith in those institutions when it's continually seen as just two parties yelling at each other about certain issues. Okay.
Your first argument is described the status quo in which you can immediately dismiss any argument on the grounds of anger. We would prefer you had to justify why anger is wrong, because it would be almost impossible to explain why we should not be angry about the lack of clean drinking water.
Well, these guys are like, it would be preferable if you had to justify something. It sounds an awfully lot like a world in which dispassion, objective debate about whether an issue is legitimate or not, is one in which is one that's preferable. Finally, on alienation, we say, firstly, the barrier to entry is higher when the norm of policy debate is anger, because people feel like someone being angry at them is a personal attack against them, which makes them far less likely to enter that space in the first place. So if you're worried about marginalized groups, those are precisely the individuals who are locked out of debate when you say that in order to engage in it, you must first bear the full brunt of the personal attacks that can be levied against you. Secondly, we say that a norm that values dispassion makes the selective instances of outrage that minority groups choose to use more powerful, because it suggests that you are so aggrieved by the situation that you live in that you would be willing to transgress the ordinary standards of behaviour and normalcy that society values, and suggests and highlights the degree to which you suffer injustice. Finally, we suggest that a norm that says that people have to constantly be angry robs minorities of their dignity and the ability to say that they do suffer, but that they are able to overcome that and do not constantly have to be angry about the situation in which they live. That's why we oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his remarks and invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
It is the absurd argument of opening opposition that being angry leads to barbarism or violence or an inability to make compromise that has allowed political elites to draw attention away from some of the most important issues, to discredit some of the potentially most eloquent speakers from having a say in public discourse, and claim that politics is not about helping the disempowered or helping people rise up, but instead is about compromise, is about bipartisanship, and isn't something that the everyday person should partake in. We're not standing by barbarism or by attacks on the streets or by ineloquent explanations of why you are angry at opening government. We are asking for an honest portrayal of the ways in which the vast majority of people are at times let down by the political system. You can be eloquent and angry. You cannot be inspiring and disimpassioned. We should inspire people to take notice. We should inspire people to get involved. You can only do that when you tell the people what they need to hear, which is you have a right to be angry, and if politicians don't listen to your anger, they are fundamentally failing you. The first question I'm going to ask in this speech is what this does to representation and engagement with minority groups. The first thing I want to explain here, though, is why we won't see the crazy world of opening opposition without a norm of a willingness to express anger in politics. The first thing to note here is we gave you preemptively as Prime Minister the reasons why politics would not devolve into necessarily unreasoned discussion. Because unreasoned and not angry discussion is not synonymous. That is a lie of political elites. You can say, I am angry that my politicians cannot even pass body cameras in my state. You can say, I am angry that only 3% of rape cases succeed in court. You can say, I think, therefore, you should do these simple policy suggestions. You can say that with a raised voice. That is angry and impassioned and simple and understandable for everyone across the political spectrum. They are standing by jargon, and they are standing by justifying jargon by, frankly, the weak arguments of opening opposition. Why is it that people won't revert to this kind of barbarism? The first thing to say is people can recognise that this is about passion. The second thing is people want policy. We claim that anger can start a discussion, anger can perpetuate a discussion, anger can call out poor instances of behaviour. At some point, people would also like to see policy being talked about. And notice here that even if you think they've successfully diagnosed what anger looks like in the status quo, we explained in our second point of substantive why the reason anger looks like that in the status quo is that people's anger is boiled up. So even if you are thinking in your head, it is true that angry politicians get away with personal attacks and not talking about policy, which, if you follow the US, you might be partial to. The reason for that is people are not used to seeing anger in politics. You have to contrast that to a world where that is not a norm, and people will think this is a counterproductive and untargeted form of anger, contrasted to someone who does speak for me, who is impassioned about it, and also has policy. That is the argument we gave you, which was completely unresponded to at opening opposition. We will also note that people want to respect their leaders, and similarly, even if untargeted anger gets some people respect now, targeted anger is what will get people respect when this norm is taken away. And we are happy for that to be a slightly that is how the anger will manifest. By contrast, we have proved that it would be counterproductive for the anger to manifest in that way. The second thing I want to explain, though, is that they have an incredibly high bar for essentially enforcing self-censorship on some of the most vulnerable people in our population. Because the truth is, if you are killed by police or constantly vilified by men, the natural response is anger, and that anger can be best tempered when you are allowed to be angry, when you can talk about the most productive ways to be angry. And it is a high bar to say that entire movements should censor themselves and stop themselves from meaningfully representing the vulnerable people who are being spoken for, just because they think maybe some racist, sexist white dude might give you 30 seconds of speech instead of 15 seconds of speech. The reality is minorities are locked out of using non-angry communication effectively. Opening opposition says to this, like, you're underestimating people. No, you are underestimating the oppressive state in places that say that women or people of colour can't be educated properly. But even if it is true that leaders can use the language, which we gave you like linguistic reasons in, say, economic debates, that often isn't true, there's still the question of motivation. If you're going to ask, for instance, a minimum wage worker to miss work for a protest, or for a woman to stand up to like a brother or a husband who she doesn't necessarily have confidence around, the linguistics of opening opposition will not get your people motivated. They will not get your people inspired. The other thing to say here is that anger is the only way to actually draw attention to horrendous issues. So lots of these issues, the vast majority of people would be sympathetic to if they knew they were going on, and their reaction wouldn't actually be like, this is an angry minority who I hate. It might be surprise, but that is how you draw attention to it. Then you can have the reasoned discussion that opening opposition wants. Okay, closing?
Yeah, so you say that there is a difference between an unreasoned argument and being angry. If that's true, how and who distinguishes between the two?
The listeners of the argument who are capable of seeing if, say, a policy is being proposed or something is logically consistent. It is the lack of anger that means people can't tell that. You need to respond to that in our case. Secondly, on selective opposition and what this does to the privileged people. The first thing to say is that opening opposition's arguments about discourse are symmetric. There might still be issues of confidence, and as I explained why issues of personal vulnerability are not actually dealing with the kind of anger that's likely to manifest. But the other thing is this is a question of scale. So a lot of politics, if you think about it, is about empowerment. Empowerment of minorities, empowerment of people who are economically enfranchised, empowerment of future generations. That vast majority of political discourse will be hugely benefited by people being able to explain when they've been dicked over by the state. By contrast, they are centering their argument about a tiny minority of political discourse, which is trying to disempower people or trying to target particular people. We think that on the scale of harm, you are at best giving a very small benefit to that nasty politics, which largely is already using anger because it is white men, and a huge benefit to the disempowered politics that cannot get traction without using anger. They say the Republican Party does self-censor. Well, first of all, you need to be comparative. The reason why they self-censor is it's totally fine for them to self-censor because they don't need anger. When they benefit from anger, they use it and they get Trump elected. We would have been able to call him out for what it was, which was untargeted anger. This empowers the most vulnerable people. That's why we propose.
One argumentative piece of extension, which is why anger creates impetus for change in the mechanisms thereof, therefore creating a society that is more inclined to shaking people out of the bubbles or the comfort zones they are, and so more prone to action, and why that's good. But before that, a couple of pieces of rebuttal, and very importantly, a piece of framing which we think is neglected. What exactly do we think embracing anger within public discourse means? Because I don't think that it is embraced in the status quo. I think there is quite a norm against anger, and that is the norm that is precisely leveraged against women when they speak out. What we think by embracing is specifically you recognize that it has a valuable role within that discourse. So we think with that comes an interrogation of that anger. So when someone is angry, you ask them, why are you angry? What drives that anger? What are you feeling? Why are you feeling that? You interrogate that root cause. And secondly, you ask them, does this policy truly fulfill that emotional cause? Do you get that understanding of that emotion? Does it address this emotion in the appropriate way? We think that piece of framing is very important in terms of a lot of the mech that OG gets about how you actually get discussion on policy, but also in terms of dealing with opening opposition as to why we present people like Trump. So before this, let's get into a couple of pieces of rebuttal. One, I'm going to argue that I think people are inherently good at finding authentic anger, and this directly responds to the OO's case, like, well, those with power can just be angry back. I would say the reason they can be angry back at the moment is that when people have prolonged anger, they then shut them down. Why do we think that people are good at finding authentic anger? We think we are primarily evolved in order to detect when someone is being authentic or not, particularly in the case of emotions. They are designed in order for social cohesion, and part of that social cohesion in a primary evolutionary mechanism is to be able to tell when someone was being truly emotional and when someone wasn't. Why is this important? Well, because the people who are inherently more authentic are those who have been disempowered and not just those in the elite. Okay, next piece of rebuttal that I think aptly deals with most of the opening half. We would ask, who is most able to be dispassionate? Those are the people who have not had to engage in that issue. Those are the people who have sat prettily in their suites with lots of money, who haven't actually had to be involved. Why is this so important? Well, we would say that at the point where you can't even be angry, it inhibits your ability to have a voice. Why? Because when you're trying to speak up and you start getting riled up because the matters on the table are deeply personal to you, someone immediately shouts at you for getting emotional and put it in your face. The problem here is that when you can't feel those emotions and voice them, you constantly have to guard against letting them slip. That's what makes you feel tongue-tied and incompetent and unable to express. That's why we think it's so important that you actually get that, and that's where you have the true leveraging. We would say at the moment, you being overly emotional is precisely the norm that they have to support. That embracing of anger is far more likely to be sympathetic towards interrogating those emotions and understanding that they are meaningful, at the point at which those who aren't empowered have more reason to be meaningful, they gain more Patrick. We would say more power. We would say those who currently are powered have a huge interest in making everyone dispassionate. So, before this, okay, last piece of rebuttal, we would say, look, a lot of their side seems to be about conceding that they win. So they say the primary problem has been that the elites have stopped women and those who have been neglected by the system from voicing their emotions. We would say that they just concede to that and let them win. We would say at the point at which you say that those emotions are valuable, you should work to let people express them as opposed to doubling down on that. Final piece of rebuttal to help OG out here in terms of winning Trump. What we would say is it's worth noting that the primary line of why Trump gets into power is precisely because the liberal elites didn't listen to what we feel. At the point at which you set up social discourse to not hear what people are feeling, that's when they rarely feel screwed over, and that's when you truly get radicalism. Okay, with that, let's go on to our primary source of why we think this actually creates impetus. What we're going to argue here is that people tend to stick to their comfort zones unless they are shaken out of them. And the problem is that you can endlessly justify your comfort zones with many logical arguments that you can sit at home and come up with. We would say debating is a good example. You can always find arguments as to why you would rather stay with the path of least resistance and stay in the initiative that you are. We would say that emotion is particularly good at shaking people out of these comfort zones. Why? Because it indicates urgency, firstly, but secondly, we will also say that it engages a process of thought that is far more likely to create action. So the famous example is when you release 2 pamphlets to raise money. The one says there are 10,000 Kenyans suffering from a lack of water. The other says, here's a little girl in Kenya who desperately needs your help. The little girl pamphlet raises 3 times the amount of money that the dispassionate one does. Why is this the case? Well, we would say that what it indicates there is it engages the emotional side of people's brains, which inherently makes them more invested in interrogating that industry. It kicks part of our brains aren't just separated into rational and irrational emotion. The emotions are part of that rationality. They express a huge wealth of information that interrogating gives us access to. The point at which you get that interrogation, that's when you get the engagement and a willingness to change. I'll take closer.
Except the emotional leaflet of the Kenyan girl isn't a comparative. the comparative of sending out leaflets saying that it's because of British colonialism.
Look. It's an analogy. What the analogy is implementing is the idea that emotions are important in the thought process. We would say when you're calling for justice, anger is that appropriate emotion in that context. That's why the analogy works. Yes, it's not word for word the same, but it gets the idea across. Okay, what's more, we would say that anger is fundamentally important in interrogating the issues. It's relevant pieces of information in order to understand them. So when you're dealing with an issue like catcalling, a major part of getting people to understand what's going on is expressing the emotion that people feel at the point at which they are having those things being done to them. It's not that anger is just a thing that they want to express, it's that that is a relevant part of that discourse. You need to know what those people are feeling in order for you to adjudicate whether or not we invest money in trying to help them out. That anger and that feeling, at the point at which you're dealing with subjective experiences, you need to know the nature of those subjective experiences before you can understand whether it's valuable or worth the cost in order to engage. What does all of this mean on the macro level? What this means is that inherently we get a society more prone to shifting to address issues. Why is this good? Because the current status quo favors the elites. Staying safe and staying in your comfort zone favors those who are anti-climate change, anti-reforming the system. At the point at which you have a mechanism to shape that status quo, you're far more likely to get people to engage in the wider world, to be responsive to threats like climate change, to be responsive to social issues that ask you to undermine that system, and therefore to get out of their back seats, to donate money, to protest, to rally, in order to get that movement. Why do we win? Because we give you the actual mechanism why anger is a valuable part and intrinsically important in our social discourse, and we give you the relevant framing in order to understand how it comes about, and for many other reasons, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his remarks and invite the member of opposition.
What I think has fundamentally been lacking so far in this debate is a description of what angry people do and how they behave when they're angry. Right? Because I think we've had various assertions bandied around saying we can represent other people's anger, that anger will make people feel bad, but no actual discussion of what it means to be angry and how you tend to act. So that's going to be my first point of extension. Second, I'm going to talk about why that leads to worse policies, particularly for minorities in this debate. Third, I'm going to talk about violence and threats, particularly in places where, for example, democracies are weaker and public discourse is not as good in general as the rest of the debate has assumed. Most rebuttal is going to be integrated. Just one thing before I start. There was the claim from closing government that you need to know what people are feeling in order to then judge where you allocate your funding. I think this would be an atrocious way to decide on policy, and the reason for this is it means there then just becomes a direct link between how angry and how effectively the person who was explaining the thing was angry and how much we help out those groups. So if somebody manages to be enormously effective about an animal rights issue, which indeed is often one of the ones that people care about, we end up funding that far more than, for example, like a woman trying to explain why domestic abuse shelters need far more funding. I think that's a highly inappropriate allocation of resources, not a good idea. First, what does anger in public look like? What does it look like in speeches when politicians talk to us on TVs and radios? First, it means more extreme language and manner, right? It means you're more likely to be shouting. It means you're more likely to do things like swear in public. Secondly, I think it means more willingness to dismiss arguments out of hand. And this engages directly with closing government. Now, they say you can interrogate the reasons behind that anger. I suggest it is extremely hard to dispassionately interrogate A, yourself, and B, other people when you feel that shouting is happening, when you feel like you're more likely to be threatened. I think as a consequence, you are less likely to get a explicit explanation of points and why particularly you might be angry, and more of a fallback on stating that anger and stating how that makes you feel. Third, I think you're more likely to get people making mistakes, doing things like being abusive to other people. That is a hallmark of what anger does to you. It makes you lose control. It makes you more likely to say things that you will regret in future. And that's going to be extremely important in dealing with the rest of the case. Now, what do we hear from opening government on this? Now, most of their case is stating that anger is a legitimate emotion to feel, and it's really important to people. First, it is fine on our side to recognise that people are angry. That is not bad. The link they needed to prove was to show that you have to replicate that anger. I think, closing gov attempt to do that, and I'll come on to that later, but OG do not. The second thing to note is, while they say it places an additional burden on you if, for example, you haven't had the education to step into that discourse, that may be true, but there are additional burdens to anyone who steps into that discourse, and one of them we are happy with saying is restricting your anger. Bear in mind, it will always be the leaders of those groups who take the autonomous position. We think it's fine to say that those particular people can at least attempt to help that. The last thing to note within this is, on the comparative, you can draw on other emotions that do not have the same tendencies that I just explained within that. And the key difference there is why anger is separate, because of that lack of control. So drawing on sadness and saying I feel very sad is A, often more powerful, but B, not something that is likely to have those sorts of negative impacts. Third, I'd also point out in comparison with CG, they say anger is very hard to fake. I think anger is very easy to fake, right? You can rile yourself up and start shouting. Before you know it, you'll just be off and people will be aware you're angry. In contrast, feigning sadness is extremely difficult. I think that's often, for example, something that's better to deal with. No. In that context, why is that likely to lead to worse policy for minorities? I think the first thing, importantly to note, is that in the current status quo, criticising people's anger of the kind of Donald Trump, I think is actually an effective mechanism to deal with them a lot of the time. So I think it lost him an enormous amount of support from people like moderate Republicans. But here's the crucial thing to understand. At the moment, people who tend to lose control and be angry within politics are signified often as those who are more extreme in other areas. So it is a red flag for Trump that, for example, he will tend to be more angry in public discourse and causes disproportionate attention towards those things at the point where anger is not part of the norm. We can explicitly call it out. They say that this will be great because now everyone can be angry. At the point where everyone is angry, you'll find it far harder to read those people out specifically, and I think that's terrible. Secondly, in the same vein, I think you're more likely to get internal selection of more extreme people. Why? Because those who are used to being angry, who tend to have less good control of their emotions and tend to appeal less to things like reason, will end up gaining control within those things because they're better at being angrier than you are, right? But they also don't necessarily make good policy makers in the long run. I'll take you in just 1 second. But third, and crucially, I think that the polarisation this causes makes it drastically harder to get anything to happen. CG want to claim that at the point you see people's anger, you're more likely to react immediately and recognise there's something to be done. That is maybe true for a small subsection of people who are already really quite sympathetic towards it. But if you're somebody who's not, if you're on, say, the more moderate end of the party, or anybody else on the opposing side of the political spectrum, first, you're likely to immediately stop listening to them as well. Because anger tends to inspire anger in other people. And at the point you feel angry when you're listening to those people, you're often just going to switch off. That loses any ability for us to make slow, reasoned arguments to them. It is a direct function of putting this into public discourse. Closing.
So while it doesn't have to be the sole source of information, what you have to contest is why anger isn't a good source of information that should at least play a part of public discourse.
I think precisely because of the reasons I gave at the start of this speech, right? It's more likely to escalate full stop. I think the second thing to note is, at the point where anger is a legitimate response within the public sphere, I think it's one that people will likely resort to but requires less justification. So if you can't answer something and just say, that makes me incredibly angry, and explain that you're angry about it, while inspiring emotion in other people, I think that damages the ability to interrogate other facets. What is the outcome of all of that polarization that I talk about? The first thing is that generally powerful people, like majorities, will control the levers of power. On average, therefore, it means it's a bad idea to radicalize moderates, to stop them listening to your policies, because at the end of the day, you will need those votes within Parliament. I think, on occasion, what CG talk about might work, creating an angry fringe that gets large enough to gain some control. But net-net, in most circumstances, it won't, which means we don't get policies passed that we need, we don't get challenges to police violence in the US. Ultimately, these people lose out. I think that is the most comprehensive explanation of why that long-term political policy is bad, and we win the debate on it. Secondly, briefly on violence and threats. First, at the point where I think you stoke anger generally, you're more likely to get angry people on the street who will not have the restraint that closing gov want them to, but will be more likely to translate that anger into violence. But secondly, and crucially, at the point where in things like public rallies, right, where often you have counter-protesters, for example, you're more likely to get direct violence happening there, which makes it incredibly threatening for people to go to those events, particularly people of, from minority groups who have suffered violence before. Ultimately, that makes public a worse place for them to be and causes them to suffer. Very, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his remarks and invite Government Whip to close government's case in the round.
In this debate, the team that wins is going to be the team that is able to show you why their mode of social engagement is one that results in the most accurate advocacy for social policies and results in the best changes that address actionable needs in society. What Desmond has told you in extension is specifically why embracing anger, saying that's good, feel that, explore that emotion, tell me why you feel that emotion, is what directs towards engagement in the best policies and specifically gives leverage and credibility to the people who are most exposed to anger, i.e. the people who live the most unjust lives and get angry the most often. In that world, we think we help the most marginalized and disempowered people by embracing this norm, and therefore we should win this debate. Firstly, let's do some clarity. Then I'm going to explain to you why Desmond's argument about what it means to embrace anger was so important, and then I'm going to show you why we get the best social change, specifically in a movement that is spearheaded by the kinds of minorities and marginalized groups that the opposition bench wants to talk about so much. Firstly, in terms of clarity, they've tried to push onto us a lot of burdens of doing this in a bad way. So they're like, it'll be personal attacks, or you can't be angry all the time, or like, we'll use anger selectively, which is my favorite one, because if they value using anger, then surely embracing the norm of anger is the best way to do it, because it forces people to recognize the value when people feel angry and acknowledge that in the way in which it's done. We don't think that this has to be about personal attacks. We think specifically, mostly when you rarely explore why you're feeling angry, i.e. actually embrace what it means to feel angry, it's far more likely that it won't be about personal attacks, and it'll be about finding the root cause of that anger, and we think that in experiencing that emotion, you get a better articulation of exactly what it is that is making you angry. Until you feel the emotion, it's incredibly hard to point to exactly what it is that is causing you to feel so uncomfortable, especially when you're talking about subtle things, like subtle discrimination, subtle icing out, or subtle catcalling. So those kinds of things we think are far better on eyesight. In terms of not always being angry, we think degrees of anger are able to exist, so you can be more angry about the things you care more dearly about, and as a result, they get more priority. That's completely fine on our side. What is the comparative? Because, oh my goodness, all these other emotions they think are good are not their comparative. The words in the motion were dispassionate objectivity. That's factual. They have to support the side that is about statistics, that is about saying, well, we're going to talk about unemployment. We're going to talk about the number of jobs people have, or the number of hours that they work for. That's not the same as being hopeful and saying, you're going to be free in the future. That's something that more likely is going to flow from the emotion of anger, saying, it's unfair that I'm not free right now. It's unfair that I'm oppressed by the situation in which I am. Those things are far worse on their side. They need to engage with what the debate actually is. In terms of our side and in terms of the burden on us, we say that anger is relevant, and this is a good way to articulate that in a way that actually directs towards policy. If it's relevant, you should side with us. And both teams have conceded that anger is something that is relevant when they make arguments about the ways in which anger is useful sometimes. Finally, critically to point out, when they say that anger is so toxic, on their side there's still anger. They've never contested that, and in fact, both government teams have pointed out that anger exists at the moment when we don't embrace that norm. Given that, they have to defend a world in which that anger is less well-directed and less well understood, therefore more likely to be violent in the ways that they are concerned about. Right, let's get into talking about what embrace means, and I think I've done that a lot in my framing already. Desmond provides you that, and specifically therefore provides the mechanism for why it is that through anger we get the kinds of attention that draw us towards policy, specifically when we embrace anger rather than when we just feel angry. So when we have a norm of embracing anger, we recognize and value the role that anger plays, we interrogate it and explore it, and the impact is that you're far more likely on our side to get to the true root of the problem and discuss potential solutions, because you discuss how it is that we can resolve and deal with anger comes from. On their side, when you don't truly understand anger, it's far more likely that you have a world in which people are pulled towards populism because they don't truly understand what's making them angry, and so just the sight of anger is something that is appealing to them. Additionally, here what we say, and this directly responds to CO, you gain more control over your anger when you experience it more often and you understand how to engage in those emotions in a way that is healthy and constructive. Given that people like to live healthy and constructive lives, it's very likely that they will try to evolve useful ways to engage in that anger. No, thank you. Secondly, you gain valuable emotional information that is currently locked up in heuristics. As humans, we evolved to feel emotions so that they can point us towards certain things that are important. If we don't express and feel those emotions, it's very hard for us to articulate and understand the important issues that are causing us to feel those emotions that we are evolved to be directed towards. And that's why anger specifically is a good way to direct us towards finding additional value. What is the impact of all of this? When you embrace anger, minorities articulate the way in which they're experiencing difficulty in ways that are more helpful and more targeted towards policies that actually help them and change their lives. That means that on our side we have advocacy that is more directed towards actually helping the people who need it the most. That should be the most important impact in this round, because it's about helping the most vulnerable people who are most angry the most often, getting exactly what they need to help themselves. I'll take opening.
You have just never proved that the self-examination of this norm in favor of minorities is likely how this norm will happen. What is likely is the powerful will use anger to dominate and exclude minorities from political spaces.
Okay, I'm going to talk about why that's not the case. Cool. So, talking about why minorities will be able to dominate anger. Firstly, we tell you that humans are naturally evolved to seek authenticity because we're inherently social beings that seek out authenticity and social connection. That means that people who authentically experience anger get greater leverage. Why is that most likely to be minorities? Because they experience anger the most often, because they experience the most injustice, and therefore have things to be angry about. Additionally, what we see here is that actually minorities are very good at handling anger. So the idea they're going to be frozen out, no thank you, is actually untrue. Because minorities often have high tolerance for anger because they feel it so often. Often people with privilege experience less anger, and so they're less shocked by it, which means they actually have less of a comparative advantage of engaging in anger politics. Which is why we think on our side it's most likely that this kind of movement is one that is going to be led by people who have been disadvantaged and marginalized in the past, because they have the instinctive reaction of, I'm experiencing injustice and I deserve to be angry about that. Why is it the case that they're likely to have that kind of reaction? Because unfairness is something that we've seen people be able to recognize. We've seen that throughout history, and we think that it's very likely that that'll continue to be the case. Additionally, what we say here is that when you're an expert and you've spent the most time engaging in these issues, i.e., if you've worked in a rape crisis center, you're most likely to have seen the things that justify you getting angry and motivate that anger. And consequently, you have those people spearheading the calls for change. That means, again, that the change is most tailored to the most marginalized and vulnerable people on our side of the house. On their side, when you have dispassionate objectivity, that balances both sides. It's easier for elites to say, oh, well, there are two sides to this. We don't have to engage, and then they opt out. When there's an angry, single, unified narrative, it disrupts the norm more, and it forces people to take these issues seriously. That's how you get change, representing the most marginalized and vulnerable people best. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for her remarks and invite the opposition whip to close opposition's case and indeed the round.
I think that if God can prove that anger is used when it is legitimate and in limited ways, and the populations are capable of correctly judging when anger is reasonable and when when it is unreasonable, they win this debate. Unfortunately, they do neither. And what Louis points out in his speech is that there are going to be two consequences from this policy. One, that anger is going to become the norm. It's going to become hugely widespread and take over all public discourse. And secondly, that the radicalization and angry society that this motion will create will lose the ability to understand other people's concerns, will lose the ability to live in a peaceful society. That's why we win this debate. I'm going to do two things in my speech. Firstly, explaining why this will lead to an explosion in anger and why it is so harmful. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about radicalization. Let's get straight into this. Because the first thing I want to note is that under the status quo, showing anger is universally criticised, right? And we know that it is possible to criticize white men who are angry. We point out, for instance, that instances where Donald Trump was perceived to be out of control, was perceived to be a furious, raging man, was often a successful means in which people could take his voters away from him, kind of moderate voters that were able to be convinced by the other side. The response, they say, is that anger is legitimate under the status quo. Sure, it is somewhat legitimate, but at the point at which you accept embracing anger as a complete norm, it becomes more widespread, and usually you lose the ability as a more calm, reasonable person to critique that anger. They say, well, this is fine, and this is the GovWhip response to this point. This is fine because minorities feel more anger because they are more oppressed. I think it is true that white people and sort of privileged white men feel less legitimate anger, but it doesn't mean they don't feel as much anger, right? A lot of white men feel very angry that they are being discriminated in society, so they're going to express that anger more and more, particularly at the point at which you say that embracing those inner feelings is entirely legitimate. And crucially, you're more likely to empathize with your own group, right? So you're more likely to empathize with Donald Trump. Crucially, in terms of weight, I want to note that the only way in which you can get support for the worst types of policies is often by appealing to anger, right? The only way in which you can convince people to really turn on immigrants is to properly rile them up, is to make them furious at the way in which those groups behave. So the point at which we can critique anger, we can say that anger is often illegitimate and bad, we can push that down. But what they say is that we need to have anger because it's often the only way in which minority groups can express their feelings. The problem with this argument, however, is they never explain why that anger, when expressed by a minority group, will be taken seriously. So, for instance, when we POI the DPM and ask, how can you distinguish between unreasoned and reasoned anger? The response is, well, it's the decision of the listener makes. We think that's precisely the problem. So black women are still going to be seen as angry and instead criticised for showing that anger. So that point is uncomparative. What is comparative is that under the status quo, we can criticise people like Donald Trump. We can criticise majority groups when they violate these kinds of norms. What do we hear from CG on why anger is necessary? Two things. One, that it's often the only way to break into people's comfort zones. I think the reason why the response to the POI we got was insufficient was that just because some emotions can motivate people to think about different issues, often anger is a very bad way of doing this because often the response that you have to anger is to retaliate in yourself. Finally, they say that often expressing anger is the best way of convincing people about your own personal problems, for instance, sexual harassment. I think it's entirely legitimate for people to be furious about those issues. But I want to note that when you're trying to convince someone that there is a legitimate problem who hasn't experienced those things themselves, often cool, dispassionate explanations about what happened to you and how it made you feel are better. I look at the fact that, for instance, Christine Blasey Ford was praised for displaying precisely those emotions, whereas Kavanaugh was condemned as a sort of angry bigot. Not yet. Why does Louis point out, however, that anger becomes more widespread as a result of their policy? One, because all leaders now aspire to anger as a key source of legitimacy. And crucially, we would argue that there is no real way in which you can tell between what is reasonable and legitimate anger and what is bad forms of anger. No, thank you. But additionally, we say that anger will pervade society. And that it becomes now legitimate when you are criticised to respond with anger. That means, for instance, people are going to take being called out on their privilege much worse. Because instead of saying, I need to engage dispassionately with this comment, they will feel entirely legitimate and allowed to respond with fury in response. Finally, it becomes the case when you have a very angry society in which people are encouraged to express their emotions whenever they feel them, it becomes more likely that people lose control when they are angry and say something which further radicalizes. Go.
Communities ravaged by globalization stay angry, no matter what the representative says. We would prefer they could go to a mainstream politician with constructive solutions to anger, rather than an extremist outside the mainstream, which is the thing that actually causes violence.
Sure. I think Louis responds to this point when he says that an ideal of dispassionate discourse doesn't mean you have to completely ignore, particularly as a leader of a minority group, anger. So he points to the instances in which leaders of, for instance, the civil rights movement could say dispassionately, my people are angry and let me explain to you why that is the case. That can often gain support. However, at the point at which that leader becomes radicalized into being as angry as possible, you lose the ability to explain those issues and you turn people off. This leads into the problem that this will have in terms of a loss of empathy. Firstly, Louis points out that often a key group in getting social change are relatively moderate people, particularly from a majority position, and that they often won't be able to empathise with direct anger, but may be willing, because they value, under the status quo, dispassionate discourse, to have that problem explained to them. I would note that, for instance, if you dispassionately explain that lots of people can't access drinking water in Flint, that can trigger emotions of sadness and wanting to change the situation. However, anger is more likely to turn them off. Finally, you're more likely to get physical violence and attacks as a result of having anger becoming the norm. The impact is not just, obviously, people will get hurt, but it further leads to a situation in which people are encouraged to just be angry and dismiss concerns. That means you get less social change overall. We prove that this won't be selectively used, this won't be judged fairly, and consequently, we'll get a polarised, violent, and ineffective society. Very proud of it.